Hey there, folks. Welcome to episode 2 of the Veiled Path podcast. I'm Froilan. I am your host. I will be leading us through this discussion of episode 2. As we get started, first thing on the title, Triforce of the West. I had to throw in a Zelda reference, but for those nerds that like The Legend of Zelda like me, the Triforce is the foundational power in the world of Hyrule. It is a Triforce that is combined power of wisdom, courage, and then power. So for our Western foundation, I gave that this title in a tongue-in-cheek sort of way, but the Triforce of the West is the three foundational powers for this concept of the self that we've inherited in the West. Its foundation is based off of three different cultures that had the biggest impact on what progressed in what we now see as Western civilization. The three civilizations we are going to talk about today are Egypt, Greece, and Israel. Let's get started. So just a quick recap of the last episode. We went through the discussion of the self. So the self based off of the philosophies of the East. We were given the concept of the self from the ancient Indians and the Vedas, how that broke off in the Buddhist sects and philosophies, and then how it was reinvigorated through the Advaita Vedanta and subsequent Vedanta movements, and how that migrated into China and interacted with Confucianism and Taoism, and reached another culmination known as Chan or Zen Buddhism. In the West, we had a different deviation, and so in the West, our foundational cultures began in Egypt. We can trace the foundation of all of our religious philosophies and practices all the way back to ancient Egypt. So starting in ancient Egypt, we're going to discuss the creation myth account before we get started. So in ancient Egypt, their culture had a pantheon of many gods, but the highest god was the god Ra, and he was the god of the sun. The god Ra, sometimes known as the god Atun, he created the cosmos using magic. And magic is inherent in all existence. As a result of us being created with magic, we find magic is inherent in all things. So one of the mythology accounts holds that we humans were created through the tears of Ra, thus imbibing mankind with a rich emotional life, and also implying our fractured divinity as we came directly from the God source. Through our creation, humans were infused with different layers that are all sacred and important, and each aspect must be cared for. A human being is a composite of different aspects, from the physical body to a spiritual body to a body that will be judged and tried. So, beginning with the most obvious, an individual has their kat. So, the physical body is what's known as the kat. The kat operates through the power and presence of three vital layers. And these layers are known as the Ka, the Ba, and the Ren. A Ka, or the Ka, is one's life force and their subtle energy. The Ba is one's personality traits and their sense of individuality. So, we have the Ka, the life force, the animating essence. The Ba is our personality, our sense of individuality, our sense of separateness. And the Ren. The Ren is the power of being infused through our name. So even our name is attached to our sense of self. It gives us a power all of its own. So the name is just as important as all these aspects. The name itself is a part of the self and contains powers and traits. So, at birth, a person receives their kat, their ka, and their ren. As they grow, they begin to develop their sense of Ba. And following death, we are introduced to another composite known as the Sa. The Sa is the spirit body that is familiar to the form of the physical body. So the Sa is the spirit essence that maintains a similar form to the body. It's deeply and intimately connected to the body. So the importance of the Kat and the Sa is deeply linked with each other. So when a person died, their body had to be preserved. And this was because you must preserve the body in order to have a continued preservation of the soul or the spirit body attached to it. If the body, the physical body, were to become damaged, that will affect the spirit body as it goes on. And how the physical body is interred and cared for following, it must go through all the proper rites and channels in order to give the spirit body the most longevity and ability to pass through trials and potentially go on to an eternal afterlife. So for example, following the funerary rites of the physical body, the Egyptians would open the mouth of the corpse. This would aid the spirit body, or the Sa, in speech and in their ability to receive judgment. The body would also be left offerings, and these offerings were nourishment to continue the spirit's essence and force to go on. Following death, following the funeral rites, a person's Ba then proceeds to receive judgment. So the Ba then goes to a court of the gods where judgment will be had on the life of the individual, taken from the heart. So, as we've seen in classic illustration, we would see that the heart is taken from the individual and is placed on a scale against a feather. And this feather was called the feather of Ma'at. If the heart was too heavy, a person was deemed unworthy to proceed to the field of reeds, and therefore was subjugated to be devoured by the god Amit, where they would then cease to exist. If the heart, on the other hand, was judged as lighter and worthy, then the gods deemed that that individual was indeed worthy to proceed to the field of reeds and would be granted then an eternal life amongst the gods. Their spirit then can proceed to the field of reeds and hold communion with the gods. So that is just a very quick summary of what is a very rich and diverse system in the Egyptian culture, the ancient Egyptian culture. But basically, what do we see here as a sense of self? We see a sort of composite, all these different separate aspects, from one's body to their personality, to their name, their sense of individuality, and their spirit form, their Sa. All these are different aspects that form a self. Each part is important and must be cared for in order to sustain every other aspect. So we see a kind of dualism where there is no unified sense of self beginning in this ancient culture. Everything has a role and a part to play and is interacting with each other composite. So, very different than what we see in the East as far as a unified self or a no self or a sense of emptiness. Now we see all these different pieces coming together to form the whole pie, so to speak. What we're also going to see later is how the Egyptians contributed to a very juridical and legalistic sense of self, where the soul is attached to a tribunal and a legal system. We'll see that as its influence later on, especially when we discuss Israel. From there, Egypt played influencer to two major cultures that developed this idea given to them by Egypt and establish further roots into Western civilization. Those two other cultures and nations were Greece and Israel. Let's transition over to Greece and how they adopted ideas from Egypt and developed them into their own sense. Now, so much can be said of Greece and its contributions to Western civilization, almost more impactful than Egypt itself. But what occurred in Greece was a sort of big bang of the world of philosophy as we see it even today. This got started through the great patriarch known as Socrates. Now, we don't know much about the man that was Socrates, but what we do know is what was written by people around his time and his followers. Particularly, the most important of his followers and disciples was Plato. Plato used Socrates as a character in several of his works to elaborate not only on Socrates' philosophy, but on the developed philosophy that Plato took and built from there. For example, you can see Socrates appear in the works of Plato, mainly the Apologia, the Phaedo, and Alcibiades. One thing that Socrates was also famous for was developing what's now known as the Socratic method, which was a form of question and answer responses, where Socrates is not inserting any sort of statements. Instead, he is asking a question and allowing the person to answer, and from there, directing the conversation by the subsequent question. But through his method of question and answer, we are arriving at these nuggets of knowledge and truth, and we can now begin to discard any false ideas or illusions and proceed further into a deeper layer of understanding. And through the man that is Socrates and his dialogues, we see that he's constantly imploring man to examine themselves, to look deeper than what they see as the real truth, and to engage in these civic questioning and answerings to find out what is truly real and what is important for the civic life and the individual life. Ultimately, what we find in Plato's works about Socrates, that Socrates is trying to arrive at a deeper truth, that a person is more than just the body that we see. A person truly is an inner soul or spirit that is animating the body that you see. And it's this inner soul that feeds off of different things, while the physical body might feed off of food, drink, and nourishment. The soul feeds off of virtue, ideas, and deeper concepts developed by Plato that we'll find in his concept of the realm of the forms. But like I said, what's important here is that the body feeds off of virtue. A person must live a life of virtue in order to feed and nourish their soul. And through this act of living a life of virtue, the animated soul invigorates the person and the life around them. So truly, the best way to live is to live a virtuous life. If a person has vices or deep vices, not only are they harming themselves, their body, but they're going to harm the animating soul itself and bring destruction to their life all around. As I said earlier, Plato is ultimately using Socrates in these dialogues, not only to elaborate on a philosophy that was started by Socrates, but to elaborate even deeper these branches of thought and philosophy that were developed by Plato and developed further. So while we see the development of a soul inside a body that lives through acts of virtue and brings the animating vital essence to the individual, Plato then begins to give these things names and further explanation. We see this as developed in his allegory of the cave and the forms. To sum up this allegory, we start in a cave where there are several prisoners chained inside the cave, facing a wall. And they're facing away from the opening of the cave, where light comes in from outside the cave down into the cave. And so as these prisoners are chained only facing this wall on the opposite side of the opening, they see shadows move across the wall. And as these prisoners are chained, all they know is these shadows on the wall, and they begin to believe that these shadows are the reality. These are real things that they're seeing. A single prisoner ends up getting out of his chains and escaping. He heads outside the cave. As he ascends and leaves the cave, he then sees what is a deeper reality, or the actual physical objects that are causing the shadows deep down in the cave. So he's come to the realization that these shadows are not truly what's real. They're a type of reflection off of another reality. This prisoner heads back down into the cave to tell the prisoners, what you're seeing is not real. They're just a shadowy reflection of what truly exists out there. He uses this allegory to describe a concept known as the forms. So the forms are the deeper reality of all things that we see here on earth. So the forms are the most pure and perfected and beautiful conceptual idea of a thing itself. But it exists in a realm all its own. It's a real entity. And what we see here in the physical world is but a reflection. So our body is just a reflection of the form that exists beyond the body. There is the ideal form that is truly what is real, and therefore a person should cast their aims and their focus onto the realm of the forms, as that is the more perfected world than what we see here on earth. But what we see from Plato ultimately is this deep separation. What we see in the physical world is just a reflection of this more ultimate and real idea of the forms. So we see a type of dualism or separation where a sense of self and identity is not truly rooted in what you see as far as a body or the things around you, but the sense of self or identity is truly in a higher, more archetypal conceptual realm. And to find out the self, you must philosophically arrive at this realm of the forms to truly discern what that is. In Greek society, we do see one more minor deviation. So while Plato used Socrates to not only explain Socrates' own ideas, but to elaborate further on his own, following Plato, a disciple of Plato we see named Aristotle, make minor deviations from this philosophy. So what we see as a difference is that the soul or the spirit itself is not a completely separated force that is a deeper reality of the body, but we see it as a result of a life. So we see that this soul-body connection is a life function of being a living organism. So yes, the soul spirit exists, but it's not a separate force that is animating the body. On the contrary, it's more like because there is a life and existence, now the soul is animated from that reality itself. But ultimately, we see that the two are tied together. So it's just the relationship explanation is modified slightly through Aristotle, but we do see these separate realms exist between the physical and the spiritual and the conceptual. Now, just one side note, there were several famous schools of philosophy in Greece following Socrates and Plato. These three men are the most famous, I will say, of the Greek philosophers, but we did see some other schools of philosophy. I'm not going to get into all of them, but just as an example, we see other schools that deviate even more severely such as the Epicureans, where they developed a concept of the soul merely as existing as united atoms that are actually physical. So even the soul itself is not a separate energetic entity from the body. It is only existing purely from the atoms inside of a body. And once a person were to die, the soul would die with it. So we see what's called a more naturalistic explanation appear even in these Greek schools of philosophy, contrary to what we see from Plato and Aristotle. Now, progressing in history, we do see that Greece and Egypt then began to come deeper into contact with each other and play influence with one another's philosophy and religions. So we did see that Greece began to send traders and workmen into Egypt around the 7th century. But what we see later through the imperial ruler Alexander the Great, who then conquered Egypt, or more like just waltzed right in and established his rule, particularly in the city that will become very important, known as Alexandria. We see a deep intermingling between these two areas where they begin to discuss their philosophies with one another, and we start to see a fusion of ideas appear. Alexandria itself was a very important city in history. We have tales of a world-famous library that existed that was eventually destroyed through a fire, but Western civilization mourns that fire, as we believe there were treasure troves of knowledge as far as what was stored in that library that is just permanently lost forever. But Alexandria was a major trade city, so it definitely became a quick stop amongst the two nations and where philosophers met with each other to discuss their ideas. So through this syncretism, we then begin to see the Platonic philosophy evolve from there. So Platonism, again, what was started as a philosophy with Plato himself, went through several phases. There was early Platonism, Middle Platonism, and then what became known as Neoplatonism, which continued on from there. And we still see it pop up as a popular group of ideas throughout time and history. And Neoplatonism is a syncretic culmination of the dialogues that were had between Egypt and Greece to merge these ideas together into a systematic form of philosophy. So it's around this time that monotheism was definitely coming into vogue. And so through these ideas, we then see that the culmination of this philosophy is what's known as the monad, where the monad is the ultimate source of all things. So as the early civilizations of Egypt and Greece had their own pantheon of many gods, the system got developed so much further that they began to simply merge all the ideas, and everything seemed to culminate into one singular aspect. So even amongst the Egyptian cultures, there were time periods where they played around with a strict monotheism, but that eventually fell out of vogue. So in Greece, they had their own pantheons, but through philosophy and through them debating with the poets about the reality of the gods and what are the nature of the gods, they came to this idea that there had to be one perfect source where all things came from. And they called this the monad. So even our sense of self is an emanation from this one monad. It appears as a separate entity, and all things that exist come from the monad and have their appearance as a separate entity all themselves. But now the true goal of all beings is to return that separate self to the monad. So what came from the source now must return to the source, and that is the goal. So while we are a separate self trying to get back to the monad, there are several layers in between that we must get through to get back to the monad. For example, the nous, which is the realm of the forms, or the soul or separate self, is another idea that we must pass through to get back to the monad. So what we see here in the culmination of Greek philosophy, we see a culmination of two philosophies, beginning with Egypt and a composite separate self that must be preserved and judged worthy by the gods to have an eternal existence, to an individual soul that is distinct from the body in an either separated or a more organic way. Finally, to the notion of a seemingly separated soul that ultimately finds its home in the one source of all things and must truly become dissolved into that one monad. Thus, the culmination and total completion of a sense of identity and self. Now, let's pivot to our third civilization that had the biggest impact on Western civilization. Starting in Egypt, discussing Greece. Now, finally, we're going to move into the nation known as Israel and how they played a very important role in the history of Western thought. Now, to discuss the mythos and early tales of Israel, we're going to rely on the Old Testament of the Bible. Regardless of the historical aspects of the Bible, it's important to use this as a source only because the sense of identity that the Israelis took with them as they developed their nation are rooted in the Old Testament of the Bible. So therefore, regardless of what happened historically, what's said in the Old Testament is meant to be a reflection of their sense of identity, and therefore we can drag out these ideas and play with them a little bit. So in the Bible, we start the nation of Israel through one man. That man's name was Abraham. We see in the book of Genesis that Abraham received a vision from God, where a covenant was made that this land that Abraham lived on would belong to his future generations if Abraham would obey God and establish this covenant with God directly. Following the revelation Abraham received, he was given direction by God to perform a sacrifice of his only son. When Abraham sought to obey and sacrifice his only son, he encountered an angel who prevented the killing of his own son and let him know that his obedience was witnessed by God, and thus the covenant was established. Following Abraham, this covenant continues through the line we see with his son Isaac. Following Isaac, it goes to Jacob, the son of Isaac, and then finally to Joseph. And through Joseph and the tales of him and his brothers, we find here that the early Jewish tribes now end up in Egypt. They exist in the culture among the pharaohs, and through the narrative tale, we find that the Jews and early Hebrews here end up as slaves in Egypt. During this time, we see another man named Moses, who now is living amongst the Pharaoh family and is an Egyptian royal, receive a vision from the God of the Hebrews, letting him know that he himself is an inheritor of this covenant and that God is going to use him to deliver his people out of the land of Egypt towards the promised land of Canaan. Fast forward now, we see Moses deliver these people out of Egypt and spend 40 years in the wilderness, where further developments of the covenant between them and God are established, culminating now into the arrival of the land of Canaan. And through conquest over ages, the Hebrews then conquer this land, and we see these developments further in the Old Testament. The land of Israel, following the conquest, was ruled by judges and appointees. Following that time, in the narrative tales, we see that be consolidated to a united kingdom, starting with King Saul, followed by King David, the most famous of the Hebrew kings. Then, with the most wisest of kings in ancient history, King Solomon. And then we begin to see that the kingdom is now fractured. Following the rule of Solomon, we see the land of Israel now is divided, where you have the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. Following further wars with neighboring nations, the northern kingdom is completely conquered, and the Hebrews now removed and taken into Babylonian exile. Through the Babylonian exile, we see further developments of the beliefs of the Jewish people. Upon their return, they bring these ideas back, reestablish a temple in Israel, and subsequent developments happen later in time, particularly through the Middle Ages. Now, all this to say, like I mentioned at the beginning of this segment, it's important that we use the narrative tale of the Jewish people as they saw themselves as a byproduct of their Egyptian captivity. So the religion that they bring with them into the land of Canaan is based off of these ideas that were developed amongst living in the Egyptian culture. Subsequently, we'll find that through their Babylonian captivity, other ideas were witnessed, and these syncretic ideas are developed and brought back into Israel upon the return from exile, and further developments happen from there. Even as they encounter the Greek philosophy, we now see an even further and final development, what we'll see later. But starting in the early period, what did we see Israel inherit from Egypt? One thing we definitely see is a legalistic sense of self, where a formal covenant is established with the Most High. The God of the Hebrews establishes this covenant with them and asks that they obey the law given to them in order to honor this covenant. So because God has shown the nation of Israel mercy, now in return, these Hebrews are obligated to follow this law as a form of thanks to their God. But we see that this law is so ingrained in society that it applies a legalistic sense onto a person and their self, their identity. So two aspects begin to emerge where a person has responsibility to uphold the law and be a faithful Jewish citizen. There's also the sense of relationship, that this God loves his people so much and that all he wants to do is live amongst his people. So the Jewish Israeli citizen holds these two in balance with their sense of identity. In Israel, we find that there was no sense of a separate soul. There were no developed ideas in the early Israeli thought. There was the individual. An individual would have his basic self, what's known as the nefesh. We would also have a sort of spiritualized idea known as the ruach, which is the emotional or moral self, this sense of relationship and responsibility that a Jewish individual holds. But through the ruach, we also saw that the ruach was a concept of the God breath. So the essence and vital life of the person is through the ruach, which is God's breath or divine spark in everyone. But this ruach connects every Jewish individual to the Most High God. Now, I know I'm saying Most High God as if this is what was established in the beginning. What we see, like the other two cultures that we've discussed, the Jewish nation had an early pantheon of many gods that were worshipped at the time. There were competing factions that fought over which god was considered Most High, but ultimately with the establishment of the United Kingdom, we now see a more centralized form of worship, particularly in the establishment of the temple in Jerusalem. Following their Babylonian captivity, the Jewish people were exposed to ideas such as Zoroastrianism, where monotheism, or more strict monotheism, was completely the thought of the area. So we see Jewish philosophy become syncretic with these Zoroastrian ideas, and now as they return into Israel, this is the period where we begin to see a strict monotheistic adherence, where the Most High God is truly the one God. there is no other gods. While there might be the existence of gods amongst other nations, as far as the Jewish individual is concerned, there is only one God over them and one God that has established that covenant with them. Following the Babylonian captivity, we now begin to see in the biblical accounts not only the entrance of Greeks into Israeli society through conquest, but we also now see the Romans enter into the conquest tales. So we now see interaction between Jewish thought, Greek thought, and then subsequently Roman thought. These ideas existed amongst each other and developed all the way through the Middle Ages and reached a culmination in a mystical philosophy known as Kabbalah. Now, what we see in Kabbalah is a syncretic development between the Greek thought and subsequently Egyptian thought down into Hebrew thought. And what developed was a very, very rich mystical philosophy that then was adopted in various forms across Western society after its development in the Middle Ages. So we'll see old terms now that gets developed further in Kabbalah, where we do have the nefesh, the basic individual self. We have the ruach, the emotional moral self, as well as the divine spark. But the neshama is the now higher soul. So now we see the Greek influence of these ideas come in, where now there is a spiritual self in existence that's separate from the body. And Kabbalah discusses ultimate reality in what's known as the 10 Sephiroth, or the Tree of Life. So the Tree of Life is a development of the idea of God, where God exists as one, but mystically exists through these 10 emanations, one above the other, with pathways leading directly to each. And these emanations go from the bottom, which is Malkuth, known as the kingdom. Earth, we find ourselves here, is Malkuth. All the way up to the Ein Sof, which is the transcendent, mysterious form of God. So, like I said earlier, the Nefesh, or the basic individual self, finds itself in Malkuth. The Ruach is above Malkuth, in the Sephiroth, or emanations above Malkuth. And the Neshama is in Bina, or above. So, and Bina, we see, is the third emanation. So there is a type of Trinity at the top of the Tree of Life, where God exists in these three emanations, or the transcendent God exists in these three emanations, and Bina is the third emanation. So what do we see ultimately with this Kabbalah philosophy developed in the Middle Ages is that we see that an individual person not only is a basic separate self, but through their connection to the divine, an individual exists in each of these emanations of the Most High God. So a person contains that vital spark, that transcendence, and is a link in themselves to the entire cosmos. So what we see here is mankind moving away from, as far as a religious sense, moving away from a priestly system where individuals take their offerings to the priest, and the priest now performs the sacred rites on behalf of the individual to God. We now see that every individual has direct access to every aspect of God, and therefore is their own priest. So we see that even on a spiritual level, this sense of self is connected so intimately to the divine that then brings question of the need for these outer forms of worship if this inner life exists altogether. Moving on to final points. Now, what do we see across these three cultures that's different than what we saw in the East? We see a sense of self, not only rooted in a sense of individual identity, but we also see that a sense of self is not separate from the culture around it. In the Egyptian sense, an individual's self is connected deeply with the gods and the imminent judgment that will come at the end of one's life amongst the gods. In Greek society, we see that an individual's soul and spirit is fed through virtue, but this virtue also exists in our relations with other people. Exercising virtue in every aspect of one's life affects how you treat other people around you. In the Hebrew society, a covenant is not established through one individual person alone. It's through one person that an entire nation or community is now in deep relationship and covenant with the Most High God. So we see that these ideas are brought in to help develop not only a sense of community, but expanding further into the polis, civilizations, the kingdoms. And now all these people, their sense of identity is not just tied to their sense of individuality, but to their nation as a whole. It becomes now a brotherhood amongst your neighbors. So our sense of responsibility began in Egypt with the responsibility to have a good life, if judged worthy, will continue on in the afterlife. In Greece, we saw the idea of living the virtuous life now extending from the physical world into a more realized and idealized spiritual world where ultimate truth and identity exists. Greek philosophy expanded these spiritual ideas of virtue and truth, and everyone sharing a common goal to live a life such as this, which would expand into the polis and into the government and rulership. Finally, we see in the Israeli model a sense of self. We see it as one unified entity that contains a relationship and connection, not just to family and physical dependence, but a covenantal dependence on the one transcendent God who gives individual life. It is through the responsibility of adhering to law that the Jewish self can flourish and live the life that was ordained by God for that person. In the beginning, we see the small idea of a fractured notion of self being a composite in Egypt, to the Greek concept of dualism, where there is the physical and the spiritual, the soul and man, form and substance. All the way to Neoplatonism in the ideas of the one versus the many. In Israeli philosophy, we see all this become simplified and unified. There are deeper layers of meaning as seen in developments like the Kabbalah. But we are given the affirmation that what is physical is not lesser than some notion of a higher spiritual concept. We see that the physical is just as important as the spiritual. Therefore, what exists in the physical world must be cared for just as much as that which exists in the spiritual world. And to bring harm to one could have negative ramification to the other. This is a very distinct difference that we'll find in the Western world. In the Eastern world, the physical world is deemed very illusory, almost, depending on the school who you ask, not being real. Whereas transitioning into Western philosophy and a sense of self, we now see that the physical self is deeply and intimately connected, and you cannot disregard the physical. That the physical itself is a good thing as it was created by the divine. So the physical itself is a part of the story. But that wraps up our episode this week. Let me know in the comments below if you guys have any suggestions. But I really like this episode because it really develops the foundation. Our sense of self is so tied to spiritual ideas and religions, but as a Western individual, these are the roots that we're getting at that develop further into the ideas that we see today. Moving on, I want to move into the recommended books this week. First book I wanted to recommend is Mystical Kabbalah by Dion Fortune. This book has become a type of introductory canon work on approaching the Kabbalah, how the Kabbalah works, and how we can develop ourselves using the Tree of Life. Dion Fortune was a mystic, and she had deep study and knowledge of the Kabbalah, so she is definitely a good source to use. If you wish to learn or develop ideas of the Kabbalah further, I would recommend the Jewish sources, so I would definitely recommend the Sefer Yetzirah or the Bahir. If you have a lot of time on your hands, you can investigate the multi-volume work of the Zohar. If you wish to investigate Greek philosophy, I definitely recommend Plato, particularly my favorite work of his, The Republic. But if you wish to investigate Neoplatonism, I definitely recommend the Enneads of Plotinus. That is the central source of Neoplatonism, and other ideas were elaborated on from that work. As far as Egyptian culture, I would always recommend the Book of the Dead, but also there are other works that you could utilize to investigate what the early Egyptians believed and how their religions and beliefs evolved across time. Thank you guys for listening to this episode. I love you so much. Please like and subscribe. Hit the bell icon so you can get notifications of every new episode that drops. Leave a comment below. Let me know if you have any ideas of upcoming episodes or book recommendations for me. I always love book recommendations and I'll always check them out. Thanks, YouTubers. See you next time.